Hey there. If you've ever thought medieval cities were chaotic, filthy, and lawless, you'd be half right. Because yes, they smelled like despair and cabbage soup, but somehow, they worked. People didn't just live in them, they survived, thrived even under a bizarre collection of rules so specific, so strange, that they make modern bureaucracy look merciful. Tonight, we're going to wander through those narrow, uneven streets and learn the logic of a world that shouldn't have worked, but did. So, get comfortable. The smell might be terrible, but the storytelling's clean. Let's start with something simple. Medieval cities were alive in the truest sense. They weren't static walls filled with people. They breathed, they rotted, they healed. Every street, every market, every sewer had a role to play in the organism. And the rules, however odd, were the arteries that kept it from collapsing into pure chaos. The first thing you have to understand about a medieval city is that it didn't have a plan. Not the way we think of cities now, no grid system, no zoning laws, no civil engineers making PowerPoint slides. A city began as a cluster of trade stalls near a river or monastery. Then someone built a house. Then someone else built a house leaning against that one. And before long, you had streets so narrow that you could shake hands with your neighbor from your window, which, by the way, was sometimes how they passed chamber pots too. So, rule number 1, don't waste anything, especially space. If a gap existed between two buildings, someone would fill it with a shed. If there was a corner of the market unused, someone would set up a fish stall there. It wasn't greed, it was survival. Land inside the city walls was precious, and walls were expensive. Built from stone, defended by taxes, and guarded by men who occasionally remembered which side they worked for. So, if you were lucky enough to have property inside the walls, you built up, not out. That's why medieval houses literally leaned toward the street, each upper floor jutting slightly farther than the one below. They weren't trying to look whimsical. They were avoiding taxes. See, cities like London and York taxed land by its footprint, not by its height. So naturally, people responded with architectural defiance. Your ground floor might be 10 feet wide, but by the time you reached your attic, you were nearly touching the neighbor's roof across the road. And there it was, a legal loophole turned into urban geometry. The streets grew narrower, the air grew darker, and the people adapted by making candles their sun and gossip their entertainment. But that wasn't the strangest rule. Oh no, that was just the beginning. Because once you packed a few thousand people into a city built for a few hundred, things started to get aromatic. The medieval world had a waste problem. Not the kind that could be solved by infrastructure, because infrastructure back then meant a guy with a shovel and hope. So every city developed its own rules for waste management, rules that sound absurd now but were deadly serious. In York, it was illegal to throw anything wet or foul out your window after 10 o'clock at night. Before 10, perfectly fine. So, if you were an unlucky traveler walking through town at 9:59 p.m., you had approximately 60 seconds to clear the danger zone before someone upstairs emptied a bucket of yesterday's stew, or worse, onto the street below. And in Paris, things got so bad that a law was passed requiring citizens to shout, "Garde à l'eau," meaning, watch out for the water, before throwing anything out. But of course, the water wasn't water. It was everything that wasn't water. Now, you might be wondering, why not just have sewers? And they did, sort of. But these weren't the underground marvels of Roman engineering. They were shallow trenches running down the center of the street, open, fragrant, and shared by everyone. Rain washed them occasionally, which was the closest thing the medieval world had to sanitation. And yet, cities endured, because somewhere between the chamber pots and the cobblestones, people figured out how to live with the smell of their own survival. Still, cleanliness mattered even if the definition was flexible. For example, it was against city rules to slaughter animals within certain boundaries. Butchers were required to work outside the main walls. not for animal welfare, but for olfactory preservation. Because when you're trying to keep rats and plague from declaring citizenship, even the smallest rule helped. And speaking of rats, they had their own unofficial kingdom. No city could get rid of them completely, but many tried. Some towns offered bounties for every rat tail turned in. Others simply encouraged cats to roam freely, though that came with its own superstitions. Because in a world where cats were sometimes accused of being witches' familiars, owning one could either save you from disease or get you burned at the stake. It was a coin toss. Then came the markets, the beating heart of every city, and the birthplace of its strangest laws. Markets weren't just places to buy things. They were civic theaters where everything, gossip, justice, punishment, happened in full view. And to keep them running, towns created rulebooks that were half legal text, half moral sermon. Take bread, for example. Bread wasn't just food, it was sacred economics. Bakers could be fined, whipped, or worse if their loaves didn't meet the official weight. And to prove fairness, inspectors called ale tasters or bread weighers wandered the stalls, armed with scales and a terrifying sense of purpose. Imagine a man in a leather apron weighing your dinner like it's a matter of national security, because it was. If a loaf was found too light, the baker might be forced to parade through town carrying his underweight bread as a public humiliation. Repeat offenders were dunked in rivers. That's right, the ducking stool, not just for gossiping women or witches, but for bakers who mismeasured dough. These weren't symbolic laws. They were survival mechanisms. Because if bread was short-weighted, it meant hunger. And hunger meant riots. A city could forgive bad manners, bad smells, even bad plumbing, but not bad bread. You can already see the pattern. The rules of the medieval city weren't about logic, they were about balance. A delicate, messy, often ridiculous balance between chaos and order. Every strange law, from waste disposal to bread weights, was a thread in a web that kept people alive, even when the world around them seemed determined to kill them. So, as we step deeper into this world, keep that in mind. Behind every absurd medieval law was a simple truth, that the only thing more dangerous than too many rules was having none at all. Now let's walk deeper into those streets, because the next rule isn't about bread or waste or architecture. It's about survival itself. How cities, faced with plague and panic, learn to police the living and bury the dead. And if you think the curfew laws today are strict, wait until you hear what medieval ones sounded like after sunset. When the sun set over a medieval city, the rules changed. Daytime was for trade, gossip, and half-hearted sanitation. Nighttime was for fear. And because fear always breeds rules, the medieval world invented a whole new set of them for when the light went out. Imagine this. The last glow of daylight slipping behind a jagged skyline of rooftops and chimneys. The marketplace grows quiet, the echoes of the day slowly swallowed by the thick, smoky dusk. Someone rings a bell. Not a church bell this time, but the curfew bell. Its low toll means one thing: go home, stay home, or risk what waits in the dark. See, medieval cities didn't trust the night. They believed it belonged to thieves, heretics, drunkards, and worse, disease. So once that bell rang, the gates were locked, the guards took their posts, and a thick silence settled like dust. Curfew itself comes from the French couvre-feu, literally, cover the fire, and that wasn't poetic. It was an order. Every hearth had to be covered, every candle snuffed or shielded by a hood. Open flame meant danger. A single spark could leap from one thatched roof to another, and before dawn, an entire district could vanish into ash. So, when the curfew bell rang, you weren't just told to go to bed. You were told to smother your world into darkness. The city fell asleep under its own blanket of rules. But of course, not everyone obeyed. There were the nightmen, city workers whose job began when everyone else's ended. They emptied cesspits, dragged refuse to the outskirts, and occasionally collected the dead. They were the city's quietest heroes, if you could call them that. By law, they could walk the streets after curfew, but only if they carried a lantern, a badge, or a stench strong enough to prove their profession. No one stopped a nightman long enough to ask questions. Then there were the watchmen, the city's unofficial sleepwalkers. They patrolled alleys with staffs and torches, calling out the hours and anything suspicious. 10 of the clock and all is well. They'd shout into the dark, even when it wasn't. Their job wasn't really to protect anyone. It was to make people believe they were protected. And in between the watchmen and the nightmen were the rule breakers, the ones who believed they could outsmart the system. Thieves worked by moonlight. Lovers met in shadow. Smugglers moved quietly through the waterways, trading in whatever the city forbade by day. And the laws that tried to stop them grew stranger with every passing year. In London, one ordinance forbade anyone from wandering after curfew, without cause and without a lantern. In Paris, no stranger could stay overnight in a home unless the host registered their name with the local warden. And in Florence, certain districts banned the sound of music entirely after dark, because apparently even a lute was suspicious. Cities learned to live by fear's logic. If something could go wrong, it would, and someone would pass a law about it. But the rules weren't just about fire, theft, or music. They were about control, the illusion that order could outshout chaos. When the plague arrived, that illusion nearly broke. Picture it. A city already built too tightly, too loudly, too alive. Then, one summer, death arrives without ceremony. It starts with a cough, a fever, a few rats behaving strangely near the baker's stall. Soon, the air itself begins to change. Bells toll not for curfew, but for funerals. Priests stop blessing corpses because there are too many to bless. And that's when the strangest rules appear. To keep the living from becoming the dead, cities passed ordinances that sound absurd, until you realize they were desperate. Gravediggers were forbidden from handling more than 3 bodies a day. Citizens were banned from washing clothes in the river because the water might carry contagion. And in some towns, people weren't even allowed to speak of the plague aloud, as if saying the word could summon it faster. Venice, always practical and paranoid, invented quarantine itself. 40 days, 40 giorni, that's how long ships had to wait outside port before unloading. It worked, sort of. Other cities copied it, though few had the discipline to enforce it for long. Elsewhere, city councils passed laws requiring people to burn incense in their homes, because they believed good smells could chase out bad air, the infamous miasma. And when incense ran short, they turned to anything with a scent. Herbs, vinegar, even burning rosemary and garlic in doorways. It didn't stop the disease, but it made the city smell a little less like death, and sometimes that was enough. One of the strangest plague-era rules came from Milan. When a household was infected, the city sealed the doors with bricks. Entire families were locked inside. No one came out until the coughing stopped, one way or another. Imagine that level of control. Imagine believing that safety could be built one wall at a time. And yet, those rules, brutal as they were, worked better than prayer. Milan lost fewer people than many cities around it. Fear had turned into discipline, discipline into survival. It's strange, isn't it, that the same cities that couldn't agree on where to dump their waste managed to agree on how to outweigh death. Maybe that's the secret of medieval logic. It wasn't rational, but it was consistent. The rules of the night weren't just laws. They were rituals. When the bell rang, you covered your fire not just to stop flames, but to tell yourself that tomorrow would come. When the watchman called, "All is well," he wasn't lying, he was hoping. And when a city sealed its gates, it wasn't locking people in. It was locking the world out. Every law had 2 meanings, one practical, one spiritual. The practical kept you alive. The spiritual kept you sane. Because living in a medieval city wasn't just about surviving the plague or avoiding theft. It was about believing that rules could keep the sky from falling. And somehow, against every odd, they did. Tomorrow, the bell would ring again. The fires would burn again. The markets would open. People would sell bread, argue about prices, complain about taxes. Because as long as the rules kept coming, life did too. But as with all systems built on survival, there were cracks. Some rules began as protection and turned into obsession. Some were written to save people but ended up punishing them instead. So, let's follow the sound of the morning bell. The city is waking up, the night's laws fading into memory. It's time to meet the rule makers themselves, the guilds, the councils, and the corporations of craftsmen who decided what you could make, sell, wear, or even dream. And if you thought the curfew laws were strange, wait until you hear about the ones that dictated the color of your shoes. When morning returns to the medieval city, it doesn't arrive softly. There's no birdsong chorus, no romantic sunrise glimmering on rooftops. It's rough, noisy, impatient. A dawn full of wheels, footsteps, and shouting. The city doesn't wake up. It reboots. The first sound is the creak of carts. Then the slam of shutters, the chatter of market women setting out baskets of onions and bread. The baker's boy runs past, arms full of loaves that look nearly identical. And that's not coincidence. That's law. Because here, in the medieval city, even bread had bureaucracy. Every trade, every craft, every object had its own web of rules, written and enforced by a powerful group of people called the guilds. If the city itself was a body, the guilds were its nervous system, controlling every twitch and impulse that kept it alive. A guild was part union, part cartel, part religious club. They were the ones who made sure no one sold bread too small, cloth too thin, shoes too cheap. They guarded quality but also hierarchy. No one could simply wake up one day and say, "I think I'll be a blacksmith." No, you had to serve years as an apprentice, then prove yourself worthy as a journeyman. Then finally, if the guild allowed it, you might be called a master. Only then could you hang your own sign, carve your own mark, and earn your own keep. Guilds controlled prices, materials, and even working hours. They wrote their own internal laws, often stricter than the city's. If you broke a guild rule, you didn't just lose business, you risked being exiled from your trade entirely. And in a world where your skill was your only currency, that was worse than starvation. Now, this might sound oppressive, and it was a little, but it was also practical. A guild kept chaos at bay. In a city with no real police, no government oversight, and no consumer protection, the guilds were the invisible scaffolding holding everything upright. But their rules weren't always logical. Take the Weavers' Guild in medieval Florence. They decreed that only certain dyes could be used in certain kinds of fabric. Why? Because expensive colors like purple, crimson, and deep blue were considered symbols of prestige. If a commoner wore them, it would disturb the natural order. In other words, you could work with luxury, but you couldn't wear it. The dye on your fingers might be worth more than your entire week's wages. But heaven forbid anyone saw it on your tunic. That wasn't just vanity, it was law. Cities across Europe enforced sumptuary laws, the rules that told you exactly what you could wear, eat, and own based on your rank. They were society's way of labeling people without using actual labels. Wool for the poor, linen for the middle, velvet and silk for those who could afford to pretend they were important. Even colors had class. Green was for merchants, scarlet for nobles, brown for peasants. Gold thread was for the church, unless you were a king, in which case you were the church. One law in England went so far as to declare that no one under the rank of knight could wear fur. It didn't matter if you trapped it yourself or inherited it from your grandmother. Fur was feudal property. Imagine living in a world where your outfit could get you fined. And it happened. A tailor once recorded being dragged to court because he'd stitched a silk lining into his wife's cloak. Too nice, apparently. The court ordered it removed. The guilds, of course, loved this. The fewer people allowed to wear expensive things, the more exclusive their work became. A goldsmith wasn't just a craftsman. He was a keeper of status. A weaver wasn't just a tradesman. He was a gatekeeper of color. And so, the strange rules multiplied not to protect life, but to protect order. Still, there was an upside. Guilds trained apprentices carefully, sometimes obsessively. If you owned a pair of shoes, you could bet they were well made. If you bought a loaf of bread, it had been weighed 3 times before reaching your hands. If you lit a candle, its wick had probably been inspected by a man with an absurd title like Candle Warden. There was a rule for everything, and someone somewhere was paid to enforce it. In London, ale was tested by pouring a bit onto a bench and sitting in it. If your trousers stuck after a few minutes, the ale had enough sugar, meaning it was strong enough to sell. If you stood up clean, the brewer was fined for weakness. Science, medieval style. And while all this was happening, the city's officials, the mayor, the aldermen, the bailiffs were busy enforcing the other half of the rulebook. Taxes. Taxes were the lifeblood of a medieval city, and they came in every shape imaginable. There were tolls for bringing goods through the gates, fees for crossing bridges, duties for selling at markets, and even taxes for lighting candles after dark. You paid to enter, paid to trade, and paid to leave unless you were dead, in which case your family paid for that too. But it worked. The money built bridges, funded guards, repaired walls, and occasionally fed the poor, though more often, it fed the bureaucracy that invented new taxes. Cities even had laws about how money should look. Coins were inspected for clipping, the practice of shaving off small bits of silver or gold from the edges. If you were caught doing it, you'd lose more than your profits. In England, coin clippers could be boiled alive or hanged, depending on the mood of the judge. It was economic theater, the idea that terrifying people into honesty kept the system running. And it did mostly, because in a world without trust, rules were the closest thing to truth. Still, for every guild-approved baker and officially licensed brewer, there was always someone working in the shadows. The unregulated, the unapproved, the unauthorized medieval freelancers, if you will. They sold bread made from sawdust, ale brewed from ditch water, and candles that smelled like... Well, let's not talk about what they smelled like. They existed because rules, however strict, always create loopholes. And medieval people were masters of loopholes. One of the best examples comes from Paris, where the law required tanners to work outside the city walls. The smell of leather was too strong, too foul for polite society. So the tanners simply built shacks against the wall right on the border. Technically outside, practically inside. The city got its leather. The tanners kept their customers. Everyone pretended to be satisfied. That's the strange beauty of the medieval rulebook. It wasn't written to be obeyed perfectly. It was written to be negotiated. You followed enough rules to stay alive and broke enough to stay human. The trick was knowing which ones mattered. As the sun climbs higher over the market, the air fills with the noise of business. The baker's boy runs by again, shouting the day's prices. The fishmonger argues with a monk over the freshness of his eels. And somewhere, a city official notes it all down in a ledger no one will ever read. The guilds are content, the taxes collected, the city breathing again. For another day, at least, the strange web of rules has done its job. But the real test of the city's survival isn't in the markets or the guild halls. It's in the spaces between, the alleys, the gutters, the places where no one writes laws but everyone lives by them. So let's turn off the main street for a moment. Let's slip into the narrow world of the back streets, where the city's rules bend, twist, and sometimes break entirely. Because that's where you'll find the truth of how a medieval city stayed alive. Not in its laws, but in the ways people learned to ignore them. Every medieval city had 2 kinds of rule books, the ones in parchment and the ones whispered in the dark. The written laws were neat, official, sealed with wax and authority. The unwritten ones were messy, improvised, and infinitely more useful. They lived in alleys, in back doors, and in the mouths of people who had long since learned that survival meant knowing when not to be seen. Let's walk into that world for a while, the part of the city that isn't on any map. The streets here are narrower, damp with things you don't want to name. The cobblestones tilt unevenly, like a floor warped by too many secrets. Somewhere nearby, you can hear the soft sound of someone sharpening a knife. Not for murder, for business. Because if the marketplace was the city's stage, the back streets were its backstage. Everything that made the official economy possible, the smuggled goods, the underweight flour, the borrowed money, passed through here first. And the people who ran it, they followed rules every bit as strict as the guilds, just less legal. The first of these unwritten laws was simple. Don't get caught helping the system run smoother. Sounds backward, but that's how it worked. If a baker ran short of grain, he'd go to the alley miller, the man who bought extra wheat from smugglers at night. The baker would pay more, but he'd stay open, and the city would get its bread. Everyone knew, no one admitted. It was civic hypocrisy at its finest. Then there were the night bakers who worked when the inspectors slept. Technically illegal, practically essential. They baked smaller loaves from leftover dough, sold them to taverns, or traded them for cheap ale. They were the invisible glue between hunger and order. Without them, mornings would start with riots instead of breakfast. Another unwritten rule: help your neighbor, unless they work for the city. People in the medieval world didn't expect fairness from above. Justice was a luxury, so they made their own. If a guard was known to take bribes, the neighborhood kept track, not to punish him, but to negotiate. If he looked the other way during curfew, he'd get free bread next week. If he got too greedy, someone would accidentally spill his name to the local priest. It wasn't law, but it worked like it. You can see the pattern. The city ran on mutual suspicion and reluctant cooperation. Everyone was breaking rules, but everyone understood why. The system survived not because people obeyed it, but because they knew exactly when to bend it. Nowhere was this clearer than in the world of markets after dark. Officially, the gates closed at sunset. Trade stopped. Unofficially, the city's poorest residents came alive. Fishermen sold leftovers by candlelight. Washerwomen hawked cheap laundry soap made from ashes. Herbalists whispered about cures for ailments the church didn't approve of. You could buy almost anything in a midnight market, as long as you didn't ask where it came from. But there were boundaries, too. Everyone knew which alleys were safe, which corners belonged to which families. The poorest lived by geography more than law. If you crossed someone's invisible border, you'd pay for it, maybe in coin, maybe in silence. Even criminals had ethics. There was, for instance, an unspoken rule among thieves. Never steal from the poor. Not out of kindness, but out of survival. The poor didn't have much worth taking, and they were the best witnesses. Steal from a merchant, and no one speaks. Steal from a beggar, and the whole street turns against you. Medieval honor was a strange creature, half conscience, half common sense. The city's poor also had their own kind of insurance system, informal, of course. When someone fell ill, their neighbors left food on the doorstep. When someone died, the collection hat made its rounds quietly. No paperwork, no oversight, just the rule of reciprocity. Help now, be helped later. It was the closest thing to social security the 14th century could manage. Then there were the beggars, the city's unofficial census. They knew every gate, every corner, every baker who might hand out scraps at closing time. And they followed a code so structured that it might as well have been holy. You didn't beg on someone else's corner. You didn't fake blindness if the real blind were nearby. And if you were given bread by a monk, you shared a piece with the next man. Break those rules and you'd be chased from the city before sunset. It's strange, isn't it? The church preached charity, but the streets practiced it better. In a world where laws protected property more than people, mercy had to be learned in whispers. Even the black markets had morals. A fence who bought stolen goods wouldn't deal in church property. Too risky, too cursed. A tavern keeper might serve stolen ale, but never watered wine. The line between sin and scandal mattered. The city was corrupt, yes, but consistently so. Everyone knew the rules, even when pretending not to. And in all of this, the half-legal trade, the silent favors, the quiet lies, the strangest truth emerges. The medieval city survived not because of its written order, but because of its shared disorder. Each person carried a piece of the chaos, balancing it just enough to keep the whole from collapsing. The guilds and councils might have claimed credit, but the real work of keeping the city alive happened here, in back rooms, under tables, beside fires that weren't supposed to be burning. Sometimes the city even acknowledged it. During famines, councils would suspend laws against street vendors, letting them sell what little food they had, no matter the price. During plagues, beggars were sometimes hired as corpse collectors, paid in bread and prayers. Rules bent when death came close enough to smell. By night, the black market fed the poor. By day, the guilds pretended it didn't exist. And together, they built something strangely stable. You could call it corruption. You could call it cooperation. Either way, it was balance. And in that balance, something remarkable happened. The rise of the commoner's city. A self-regulating world that existed beneath the gaze of the nobility. The kings and bishops might have owned the walls, but the streets belonged to those who walked them. As the sun sets again over the crooked rooftops, you can hear the rhythm of that world continuing. The creak of a cart wheel, the murmur of a secret deal, the sound of someone sweeping their doorstep because even filth has to follow the rules. And tomorrow it will all start again. But before we move on, there's another kind of rule, stranger still. One that governed not what people did, but what they believed. Because to truly understand how these cities stayed alive, you need to understand their superstitions, the unwritten rules between the living and the unseen, the charms nailed to doorways, the rituals before opening shops, the prayers whispered before dumping water into the street. The next laws weren't written by councils or kings. They were written by fear, and fear in the Middle Ages was the most powerful law of all. If the guilds and markets kept medieval cities running, then superstition kept them sane. Because beneath every written ordinance and guild charter was another kind of law, one whispered rather than inked, enforced not by guards or magistrates, but by fear itself. These were the rules that no one admitted to believing, yet everyone obeyed. You could call them divine ordinances or maybe street theology. Either way, they governed the space between logic and faith, the cracks where reason failed, and people needed something else to fill the silence. Let's start where most of medieval life began. The church bell. Every city had dozens of them. Big ones, small ones, cracked ones that clanged like tin. They didn't just mark time, they marked safety. The first bell in the morning didn't simply wake you, it sanctified the day. The bells for Mass didn't just call the faithful. They cleansed the air, driving away demons, storms, and thieves. When the bell rang during thunder, people crossed themselves instinctively. Not because of the sound, but because they believed lightning avoided holy echoes. You didn't run from storms, you prayed through them. The church, of course, approved. The clergy saw fear as a kind of discipline. Every superstition could be harnessed into obedience. If people feared demons, remind them that confession was their shield. If they feared ghosts, remind them that donations to the poor could shorten a soul's wandering. And so, the strange citywide dance between heaven and survival continued. Every trade had its own protective ritual. Bakers carved crosses into their dough before baking, not just to bless the bread, but to make sure it rose evenly. Smiths sprinkled holy water on their anvils once a week. Candle makers refused to work on Fridays, since melting wax on the day of the crucifixion was bad luck. Even the beggars had blessings. They'd hold out their hands, muttering charms half in Latin, half in local dialects, promising that a single coin could lighten the load of your sin. You didn't argue with that sort of marketing. And then there were the wards, small charms, bits of bone or parchment inscribed with sacred words. They hung them above doors, tied them to children's wrists, buried them in corners of houses. Some were prayers to saints, others just gibberish written by men pretending to be holy. But they worked, people said, because the city still stood. If something bad happened, there was always a reason. A rule broken, a charm forgotten, a blessing skipped. One of the most popular unwritten rules was never throw water out a window without warning. You'd shout, "Guard low. Watch the water," before tipping your basin into the street. Failing to warn someone could invite divine punishment. Not because of hygiene, no one had discovered germs yet, but because waste and sin were spiritually linked. To splash another person with your filth was a kind of moral crime. And speaking of filth, let's talk about waste laws, where superstition and practicality were indistinguishable. Every city struggled with waste. Human, animal, industrial, it was all part of the medieval perfume. Streets doubled as drains. Rivers were both bath and burial ground. But even in this chaos, people found patterns. You didn't dump refuse on Sundays. You didn't pour blood from the butcher's shop before sunrise. And you never, under any circumstances, dumped waste near a church wall. Not because it was illegal, but because it was blasphemy. God might forgive sin, but apparently not sewage. Priests, ever pragmatic, reinforced these ideas. They claimed demons lurked in puddles left by dirty water. Spirits could travel through rot. And if plague came again, and it always did, it was not because of rats or fleas, but because sin had been left to fester unconfessed. So people confessed, endlessly, sometimes to priests, sometimes to anyone who would listen. There were even unofficial confession markets, where traveling friars set up stools and offered fast-track penance for a small donation. For every misfortune, there was a moral explanation. A lightning strike? Someone lied. A collapsed roof? Someone didn't attend mass. A spoiled batch of ale? Someone had cursed the brewer. The medieval mind couldn't accept randomness. Everything had a pattern, and every pattern had a purpose. Which brings us to another fascinating category: holy monopolies. Certain saints had exclusive rights over specific disasters. Saint Apollonia was for toothaches, Saint Blaise for throats, Saint Roch for plague, and Saint Florian, naturally, was for fire. Each trade and household had its patron. Blacksmiths prayed to Saint Eligius, bakers to Saint Honoré, fishermen to Saint Nicholas. You didn't just pick your saint, you inherited them. If your father was a cobbler, Saint Crispin became your lifelong co-worker whether you liked it or not. These rituals stitched the city together in invisible ways. A cobbler's workshop wasn't just a place of business. It was a shrine. An inn wasn't just for travelers, it was a way station for souls. The church wasn't simply a building. It was the axis that every street seemed to lean toward, both literally and spiritually. Of course, not everyone believed purely out of faith. Many just believed out of habit. Superstition was the medieval version of insurance. It didn't always pay out, but it was better than having nothing. And yet, beneath all the ritual and incense, there were moments of doubt. Quiet, whispered questions that couldn't be spoken aloud. Why did good people die first during plague years? Why did holy men get sick? Why did rain come too soon or not at all? The city's priests didn't have answers, only more rules. Pray harder, sin less, give more, obey. But even obedience couldn't fix everything. And when religion failed, people turned to magic, the other faith, the one nobody talked about but everybody tried at least once. There were women who sold potions, men who carved symbols into doorframes, and herbalists who claimed to hear the will of the earth itself. To the church, these were heretics. To the city, they were healers. You might get fined for buying a charm, but you'd buy it anyway, especially when your child was feverish or your cow refused to give milk. A city that survives plague, famine, and filth doesn't just need order. It needs imagination. And superstition was simply order's shadow, pretending to make sense of what couldn't be explained. So when night returned, and the bells rang again, people whispered small prayers under their breath. Not grand sermons, but tiny personal bargains. Keep my bread from molding. Keep my child from coughing. Keep the fire in the hearth, not on the roof. Those were the real laws of medieval survival. Not written by kings, but murmured by everyone else. And it worked somehow. The cities survived. They grew. The same people who feared ghosts built cathedrals so high that they seemed to challenge heaven itself. Maybe they didn't understand the world, but they believed in their place within it. Still, faith alone couldn't hold a city together. The divine kept people obedient, but it was fear of other people that kept them polite. The next set of strange rules had nothing to do with saints or sin, and everything to do with gossip, debt, and dignity, because in the 14th century, reputation was more valuable than gold and far easier to lose. In a medieval city, your name was your currency. Before passports, before identification, before anything as simple as a birth certificate, reputation was all that stood between you and ruin. You could lose your house, your tools, even your health and still survive, but if you lost your good name, you were done. That's why medieval life came with an entire invisible rulebook about how to exist in public. What to say, when to bow, who to look at, who not to. It wasn't etiquette in the modern sense. It was survival instinct disguised as politeness. Imagine waking up in a city where everyone knows who you are, what you sell, who your parents were, and whether you paid your market dues last week. Privacy wasn't a concept. It was a myth. The walls had ears, the baker's wife had eyes everywhere, and your neighbor had opinions about how loudly you prayed. And that meant one thing above all: never ever give people something to talk about. The rules of medieval respectability were endless and exhausting. You couldn't speak too loudly, noise was associated with sin. You couldn't laugh too hard in public. It was considered a sign of moral weakness. And you certainly couldn't walk too quickly through the market unless you wanted to look suspicious. If you were a woman, the rules doubled. Widows had to wear veils for exactly 1 year after their husband's death. Young women couldn't show their hair in church, or even at windows, because nothing said sin like sunlight on uncovered hair. And if you smiled too much at a stranger, that could ruin you faster than plague. There was even a phrase for it in some towns. She has a street face. It meant she smiled where everyone could see. Men weren't exempt either. A man had to dress according to his income, or at least what the city thought his income should be. A merchant who dressed like a noble risked fines. A noble who dressed like a peasant risked suspicion. Everyone had to look like they belonged exactly where they were, no higher, no lower. Medieval people called it order. We'd probably call it class control. And yet, these rules worked because breaking them meant social death. You could survive poverty, but not scandal. Reputation wasn't just gossip. It was an economy. Your credit, your customers, even your ability to marry depended on it. A single rumor could close your shop or turn your landlord against you. That's why medieval people were obsessed with appearances. The phrase keeping face wasn't metaphorical. It was daily life. If your roof leaked, you repaired it immediately, even if it meant skipping meals. A messy house implied moral decay. A dirty shirt implied laziness. And laziness, to a medieval mind, was the gateway to sin. They didn't separate morality from maintenance. A good person was a clean person, a punctual person, a person who said God willing before every promise and forgive me after every sneeze. Of course, not everyone followed the rules. Some made a career of bending them. There were professional reputation fixers, yes, really, friars and public notaries who, for a small donation, could draft a document swearing to your good conduct. It was a kind of medieval PR campaign. A few lines of Latin could scrub away a decade of gossip. But if you couldn't afford that, you had to rely on humbler methods. Favors, gifts, or alliances. One baker might quietly send loaves to the parish priest every Sunday. Another might offer discounts to guards who kept watch over his street. A merchant might sponsor a new candle in the cathedral, because nothing said trustworthy like public piety. Reputation wasn't about being good. It was about being seen as good. And the city made sure you were seen. Public confessionals weren't private booths. They were open benches, where you knelt and admitted your sins out loud. Court sentences were announced by criers. Market fines were posted on church doors. Even apologies were sometimes made in public, literally at the city gates, while witnesses took notes. It was surveillance by society centuries before anyone invented the word. The same system extended into business. Every trade had informal trust networks. If you borrowed money, it was on your word alone, and your word depended on your neighbor's opinion. Default once and you were out. That's why medieval debtors didn't just fear bankruptcy, they feared humiliation. Some cities forced them to wear special clothing until their debts were paid. Others paraded them through the streets holding signs listing the amounts owed. The goal wasn't punishment, it was deterrence. And yet, this obsession with honor and appearance created something unexpectedly powerful: community accountability. If someone's house burned, neighbors rebuilt it. If someone's daughter fell sick, the street collected candles for prayers. Because the same people who gossiped about you were also the ones who'd have to live with your absence. Shame and solidarity were two sides of the same coin. Still, not every rumor was innocent. Medieval cities were breeding grounds for slander. Women were accused of witchcraft for knowing herbs. Men were called heretics for asking questions. Envy spread faster than plague. That's why the church tried, occasionally, to step in with official moral guidelines, lists of sins and punishments for defamation of character. But like every other rule, they only worked when convenient. The city's poor had their own version of this moral economy. Their reputations weren't about respectability, they were about reliability. Could you be trusted to share food? To warn others when the guard patrol changed routes? To stay silent if someone stole from the docks? Among the poor, the best reputation was loyalty, not virtue. Among the rich, it was the opposite. Wealthy citizens built their names like fortresses, brick by brick, donation by donation. They'd pay for fountains, bells, statues, anything that said, "Remember me kindly." Some even bought burial space near the altar, so their good name would echo in prayers long after death. The irony, of course, is that all this obsession with dignity existed in cities that constantly smelled like sewage. But image was stronger than reality. It always is. And so, people learned to live double lives, one for the street, one for the self. You could curse at home, but you blessed in public. You could cheat in trade, but tithe in church. Everyone balanced sin and ceremony in perfect, hypocritical harmony. Reputation was their version of armor, and they wore it daily. It didn't matter if it was true. It mattered that it looked true. Still, there were moments when the armor cracked, when fear, hunger, or desperation forced people to break the unbreakable rules. That's when the city turned cruel. Because as much as medieval life depended on rules, it depended even more on the punishment of those who broke them. And in the next part, we're going to walk through that darker side. The rituals of public humiliation, the pillories, the fines, and the small, quiet mercies that hid beneath the cruelty. Because if the rules kept cities alive, the punishments made sure no one forgot why they existed. Every medieval city had its own form of entertainment, and most of it involved someone else's misery. Public punishment wasn't just law enforcement, it was civic theater, a ritual, a performance, a reminder to everyone watching that the line between sinner and spectator was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. The morning of an execution or public humiliation had an unmistakable energy. Bakers baked early, taverns stayed open late, and merchants sold roasted nuts or cups of ale to the gathering crowd. If you lived near the town square, you could hear the hammering of carpenters assembling the wooden stage. Sometimes a scaffold, sometimes a wheel, sometimes something far simpler and far more humiliating, a stool. Punishment was supposed to be about justice, but really, it was about reassurance. People needed to see that sin had consequences, that order still meant something. And so the city staged those consequences like morality plays. Let's start with the mildest kind, the public shaming. If you were caught lying, cheating in trade, gossiping, or breaking curfew, you might be sentenced to the pillory. It was simple enough. 2 wooden boards clamped around your head and wrists, locking you in place in the center of the market. Your punishment wasn't pain, it was attention. You were forced to stand there as the city walked by, as neighbors shouted, as children laughed, as someone threw the occasional rotten turnip. There was no anonymity in medieval justice. The point was exposure. Some punishments were specific. A dishonest baker might have his bread nailed to the pillory beside him. A cheating brewer might have his cask spilled onto the ground. A woman accused of gossip might wear a metal bridle over her mouth, the infamous scold's bridle, with a spike pressing against her tongue. You weren't just punished, you were labeled. And the people watching weren't just witnesses, they were participants. The city believed that watching punishment cleansed the soul, that witnessing someone else's suffering could purify your own conscience. You could jeer all you wanted, as long as you said a prayer afterward. Even the clergy got involved. Priests would walk among the crowd, reminding everyone that punishment was divine correction, not cruelty. Then they'd bless the condemned, sometimes with water, sometimes with words, and the spectacle would begin. But humiliation could turn to violence in a heartbeat. Crowds weren't predictable. If someone shouted too loudly, if someone recognized a personal enemy in the pillory, stones started flying. What began as ritual became chaos. The guards didn't always intervene. They'd shrug, muttering that God's will was being done. Still, not every punishment was public. Some were quieter, colder. If you couldn't pay your debts, you didn't go to the pillory, you went to the debtor's prison. It wasn't a dungeon, not at first glance. More like a holding cell built into the city gate or an abandoned tower. You weren't tortured, you were simply forgotten. The only food you received was what your friends or family brought. Many starved waiting for money that never came. And yet, the city told itself this was mercy. After all, you weren't dead. When punishments were meant to kill, though, the ritual changed. Executions were meant to be both terrifying and strangely beautiful. The gallows were often built on the outskirts of town, visible from the main road, so travelers would know what kind of city they were entering. Place with order. A place where sin didn't go unanswered. If the condemned was a thief, he'd be hanged. If he was a murderer, he might be broken on the wheel. If he was a noble, he might be beheaded because even death had social hierarchy. Hanging was for commoners. Decapitation was a privilege. The condemned were expected to confess publicly before dying. A good confession could save your soul and entertain the crowd. The priest would hold a crucifix up to your face, and if you kissed it calmly, the people might murmur approval. If you spat or cursed, the air would fill with stones. Every movement was symbolic. When the rope tightened, when the head fell, when the crowd gasped, all of it reinforced one idea. This is what happens when you forget your place. But here's the strange thing. In their own way, these rituals worked. They reminded people that the city had boundaries, not just physical ones like walls, but moral ones too. Every punishment was a sermon. Every execution, a lesson. The living learned how to behave by watching the dying. Of course, not everyone believed in the justice of it. There were murmurs in the crowds, quiet prayers for mercy. Sometimes mothers turned their children's faces away. Sometimes beggars wept for strangers they'd never met. The city needed cruelty to stay organized, but not everyone's conscience agreed. In fact, some punishments were almost designed to fail. The ducking stool, used mostly for women accused of gossip, witchcraft, or general disorderly conduct, often ended badly. You'd be strapped into a chair attached to a long wooden beam, dunked repeatedly into the river while the crowd counted aloud. If you drowned, you were innocent. If you survived, you were guilty. Either way, the crowd went home satisfied. Cities justified this madness by saying they were purging evil. But in truth, they were purging anxiety. Public punishment was emotional housekeeping, society's way of pretending it had control. And yet, not all cities were cruel for cruelty's sake. Some had genuinely strange but clever laws designed to restore peace rather than inflict pain. In Florence, for example, if two neighbors quarreled, the magistrate might sentence them to eat dinner together, publicly. If they refused, their families could be fined. The logic was simple. No one wants to argue while being stared at by an entire piazza. In parts of Germany, habitual drunkards were forced to parade through the streets wearing wooden barrels as clothing. Humiliating, yes, but survivable. In England, tavern brawlers might be locked in the stocks together until they made peace. Justice was creative, if not kind. The point was never just to punish the body, it was to restore the illusion of harmony. A city's health was measured by how well it contained chaos, and public pain was simply the cheapest disinfectant. Still, people were human, and sometimes humanity slipped through the cracks. There are records of guards loosening ropes so a hanging would be quick and clean, of executioners slipping a prayer into a condemned man's hand, of priests standing between the crowd and the condemned, whispering, "Look away." Mercy didn't make the laws weaker. It made them bearable. And that's how medieval cities survived their own cruelty, not by erasing it, but by softening it just enough to live with it. But not every rule of life and death was enforced by human hands. Some were written in disease, in hunger, in the air itself. And when the plague returned, as it always did, the city found itself rewriting every rule it thought it understood. Because all the order in the world meant nothing when the streets filled with the smell of death. When the plague came, it didn't knock. It didn't wait for permission or respect city boundaries. One day the market was full of laughter and trade, and the next it was empty except for the sound of coughing and the low tolling of the church bell, that single note that told everyone another neighbor was gone. The rules of the city changed overnight. The old ones about bread weights, about markets, about gossip suddenly felt ridiculous. There was only one law that mattered now. Survive if you can. But the medieval world didn't know how to survive disease, not really. They didn't have the words infection or bacteria. They didn't understand that death floated invisibly between them. What they did understand all too well was fear. And fear is an excellent lawmaker. The first rule was isolation. Cities across Europe closed their gates, sometimes literally overnight. The guards wouldn't let anyone in or out. The merchants who had left for trade fairs came back to find their own towns barred to them. A city under plague was a city under siege, except the enemy was already inside. Next came the silence. Bells rang less often. Priests stopped visiting homes unless absolutely necessary. Funeral processions shrank from a dozen mourners to one. By decree, churches could only bury at night. Not because of superstition, but because there were too many bodies and not enough daylight. And still, the rules multiplied. In Venice, they invented the quarantine. The word itself comes from 40 giorni, 40 days. Ships arriving in port had to wait offshore for 40 days before anyone could disembark. It wasn't science, it was symbolism. 40 was a holy number, 40 days of flood, 40 days of fasting, 40 days of testing. It made sense to them in the only way sense could exist amid disaster. Other cities copied the idea, but adapted it in their own ways. In Florence, suspected plague houses were sealed with red crosses painted on the doors and the words "Lord have mercy on us" scrawled beneath. Inside, families waited in darkness, forbidden to leave, while watchmen were paid to deliver food to the door and collect the dead when the cart came. No one touched anyone. No one looked too long. In Paris, the city council hired special men called corbeaux, crows. They wore black robes and carried long poles with hooks at the end, used for dragging bodies out of houses. The people believed their garments were blessed. In truth, they were just thick enough to absorb the smell. And in some places, the strangest new profession of all appeared, the plague doctor. They were not healers, not really. Most weren't even doctors. They were hired men, paid by the city to count the dead, to sign death certificates, to keep order among the dying. Their uniform was terrifying by design. A long leather coat, gloves, boots, a wide-brimmed hat, and that famous beaked mask stuffed with herbs and vinegar-soaked cloth. It wasn't for style, it was a filter. A primitive, desperate attempt to keep the air and death out. The rules they followed were precise. Never touch a patient. Always carry a cane to point instead of gesture. Burn the straw after every visit. Keep your mask on even when eating, if possible. And above all, write everything down. How many deaths? How many still breathing? How many likely to follow? The city became a ledger of mortality. Every morning, the bells of the churches marked not prayer, but count. A toll for each street, a toll for each parish. The sound of faith turned into arithmetic. People invented new customs to feel in control. You couldn't pray the plague away, but you could at least follow the little rituals that gave it shape. Don't sleep with your shoes near your bed. The devil might walk in them. Don't wash during plague months. It opened the pores to bad air. Don't eat fresh fruit. It carried death in its sweetness. The strange thing was, some of these habits helped accidentally. Less washing meant fewer shared bathhouses. Fewer gatherings meant less contagion. People didn't know they were right for the wrong reasons. And still, many turned to religion, though faith itself began to change shape under the weight of loss. Churches overflowed with candles for the dead, but priests died faster than they could be replaced. Processions of penitents filled the streets, men and women whipping themselves bloody in the belief that pain might appease God's anger. They sang as they bled, voices echoing through empty squares. Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy. But mercy didn't come. Whole families vanished in a week. Streets became uninhabitable. The living avoided touching doors, coins, even bread. The smell of burning herbs filled the air. Rosemary, juniper, and vinegar simmered together in brass pots. The city's version of air freshener and prayer combined. Rules continued to evolve, stranger and stricter. In Milan, entire city blocks were walled off and abandoned. In London, inspectors marked plague houses with chalk symbols each morning. If the mark faded, someone inside had repainted it to avoid being sealed in. A silent rebellion written in dust. And when the dying outnumbered the living, the city rewrote its laws once again. Graveyards overflowed, so fields were consecrated for burial. Coffins ran out, so people were wrapped in straw. Priests stopped reciting full prayers. There wasn't time. Requiescat in pace, they'd mutter, waving the next cart forward. But here's what's extraordinary. The cities survived. Somehow, through horror and decay, they didn't disappear, because new rules rose out of necessity. Simple, clever, quietly humane rules. Shopkeepers left baskets outside their doors. Buyers dropped coins in vinegar to cleanse them before trade. Midwives boiled their instruments. Priests learned to pray from windows instead of kneeling at bedsides. 1,000 tiny acts of adaptation, half faith, half science, held civilization together. And when the plague finally faded, the people who crawled out of their homes weren't the same ones who had gone in. The survivors had learned something fundamental about cities, though they couldn't have said it in words. Survival didn't belong to the strongest or the richest. It belonged to the most adaptable. They started to rebuild slowly. Streets were cleaned. Wells were redug. New burial grounds became new neighborhoods. But there was one rule that lingered long after the fear had passed. Never forget. Every city that had lived through the plague built monuments to it. Stone crosses, chapels, shrines. Some were elaborate. Others were nothing more than a rough cross carved into a gatepost. But all of them said the same thing in silent stone. We remember what the air can do. Life returned, but it wasn't the same life. People married younger, worked faster, lived shorter, laughed harder. They had seen what the world looked like without order, and they were terrified of going back. So they clung to their cities, their rules, their rituals, because they were proof that the world could still hold shape. But even as peace returned, something else began to change. Something quieter, but far more enduring. People began to question. Not loudly, not yet, but enough to notice. If the plague came from sin, why did priests die? If God protected the innocent, why did children suffer? If holy water failed, why did vinegar work better? The medieval mind had built a world of rules to explain everything, divine, civic, moral. But after the plague, those rules looked thinner, shakier, like walls with cracks. And through those cracks, a new kind of thinking began to grow, the first fragile breath of what would, centuries later, become reason. For now, though, people just wanted life back. Bells to ring for weddings again. Markets to smell of bread instead of smoke. Streets to echo with laughter instead of coughing. They got all of that, eventually. But they also got something unexpected. A new kind of rulebook. Because once you've lived through a world that stopped breathing, you start to notice the invisible things that keep it alive. Trade, trust, clean air, and cooperation. The next chapter of city life would be about those invisible rules. The ones that didn't come from kings or priests, but from people learning, almost by accident, how to live together. After the plague, everything smelled of smoke and lime. The air was heavy with disinfectant before disinfectant existed. The scent of burning straw, vinegar, and a faint sweetness of rot that no one mentioned but everyone remembered. The survivors had one goal: make the city livable again. Not beautiful, not holy, just livable. The strange thing about disaster is that it clears space. Physical, mental, moral. And in that space, people start inventing new rules. Quietly, accidentally, sometimes without even knowing they were changing the course of history. The first of these new rules was simple but revolutionary. Cleanliness is survival. Before the plague, filth was normal. Streets were open drains. Pigs roamed freely. Bathhouses existed, but no one trusted them. They were considered places of sin and sickness, not sanitation. The poor washed in rivers that doubled as sewers. The rich sprinkled rose water and pretended it counted. But when half the population vanished, people noticed patterns. The clean seemed to die slower. The rich who sealed themselves indoors survived longer. The air in wide, breezy streets didn't smell as deadly as the narrow ones. No one knew why, but they could feel the difference. So the city began to reinvent itself, one broomstroke at a time. New ordinances appeared. No refuse shall be left in the street after sunrise. Every householder shall sweep the space before his door. The dumping of waste near wells is forbidden. These weren't moral rules, they were survival ones. The punishment for ignoring them wasn't damnation, but disease. For the first time, health became a civic responsibility. The city even hired people for the job: rakers, scavengers, gong farmers. The gong farmers were the lowest of all, paid to clean out latrines and cesspits. Their work was done at night, by candlelight, when the smell wouldn't cause riots. They wore rags soaked in vinegar and carried torches that hissed in the darkness. They were invisible laborers, both feared and pitted. But without them, cities would have drowned in their own waste. The gong farmers' strange new rules: never dig near water, never leave a pit uncovered, never touch your face while working, were the beginning of public health. At the same time, markets were regulated like never before. Inspectors tested bread weights and milk quality. Brewers had to mark the strength of their ale. Butchers were moved to the outskirts because their trade produced too much blood. No one could explain why, but people felt safer that way. The church, too, began preaching new sermons, not just about sin, but about hygiene. Washing before prayer was reinterpreted as an act of purity, a way of keeping both body and soul clean. Monks started writing manuals on diet and sleep, turning the rhythms of daily life into almost medical advice. One Benedictine rulebook from the 14th century advised brothers to air out the bedding in the sun whenever the Lord allows clear weather. That line, meant for cloisters, quietly spread through the cities. Housewives began doing the same. Bedbugs didn't vanish, but the practice did something even more radical. It turned cleanliness into virtue. And when virtue becomes fashion, people start obeying it without question. Still, not every innovation came from faith. Some came from desperation and coincidence. In London, for instance, the Great Fire of 1666, long after the plague years, but born of the same lineage of fear, burned down the filthiest neighborhoods. People mourned the destruction, but afterward, the city noticed that plague never returned with the same fury. The fire had cleaned what laws could not. It became an accidental proof of concept. Burn, rebuild, and survive. But even before that, smaller changes were shaping cities. People began spacing houses farther apart, widening alleys, requiring gutters to channel rainwater away instead of letting it pool. The medieval city was still crowded, but it was slowly learning to breathe. At night, the old routines returned. Markets closing, candles flickering behind shutters, prayers whispered against the unknown. But something had shifted beneath all that ritual. The people had learned that survival wasn't divine luck. It was habit, vigilance, and cooperation. That realization changed everything. Because once you understand that life can be managed, not just endured, you start organizing it differently. You start counting. You start measuring. You start recording. That's exactly what medieval cities did next. They began keeping records, detailed ones, lists of births and deaths, ledgers of grain stores, registers of apprentices, and inventories of every house and shop. Before the plague, record-keeping was mostly for taxes. After it, it became a survival tool. Numbers told stories now. If too many bakers died, the council knew famine was coming. If too many children died in one parish, the plague might be returning. Numbers replaced omens. And once the world began to trust counting more than superstition, something remarkable was born. Early science. Not science in the modern sense, of course, but the first flickers of empirical thinking, the idea that observation could replace prayer, that a problem could be solved by watching carefully instead of waiting faithfully. One London physician wrote in 1361, "It seems to me that the sickness spreads where the air is unmoved, and that windows ought to be opened." It was a simple line, ignored at the time, but it contained something dangerous: logic. Other cities took it further. In Venice, Doctors began mapping where the sick lived, noticing that infection followed streets, not sins. In Paris, records were kept of which food markets stayed open longest during outbreaks. The bakeries closest to rivers lasted longest. Fresh air, they guessed. It wasn't enlightenment yet, but it was a start. The strange rules of medieval survival, sweeping the streets, counting the dead, spacing the houses, were slowly becoming the foundation of urban planning. Cities were turning from superstition into systems. Still, old habits died hard. When a new sickness arrived, people still hung charms over their doors. When storms came, bells still rang to chase away demons. The logic of fear coexisted with the logic of reason. One soothed the heart, the other soothed the mind. Together, they kept the city balanced. And that balance was fragile, because even as cities grew cleaner, more organized, more self-aware, they were also becoming hungrier for control, for order, for perfection. And in that hunger, they began to write new laws, not about filth or faith, but about people themselves. Who could live where? Who could sell what? Who could marry whom? The next evolution of survival wasn't about health. It was about hierarchy. Because once a city learns to manage bodies, it eventually decides to manage lives. By the late medieval period, the city had survived famine, fire, plague, and its own sewage. It had rebuilt itself with brooms, bells, and bureaucracy. But survival had given birth to something new, the desire not just to live, but to control how people lived. And so began the quiet transformation of the city from a cluster of walls and markets into a living machine of observation. It didn't start with malice. Started, as most things do, with good intentions. The councils wanted order. The guilds wanted stability. The church wanted obedience. Everyone wanted predictability. But predictability requires surveillance, and surveillance requires rules. The first of these new controls was the curfew. Every city had one. When the bell rang at dusk, fires were to be covered, shutters closed, and streets cleared. The sound of the bell wasn't just an announcement. It was a warning. Your business ends here. The curfew had practical roots. Cities built mostly of wood burned easily, and night fires spread like gossip. But it also served another purpose. It kept people in their place. After dark, the streets belonged to the watchman, and the watchman belonged to the council. If you were caught walking after the bell without a lantern, you could be fined, beaten, or arrested for suspicion of theft. It didn't matter if you were simply late returning home. The night had its own laws. And of course, those laws were flexible depending on who you were. Merchants with connections could buy lantern licenses. Nobles didn't need permission at all. But the poor, the washerwomen, the apprentices, the night bakers, lived at the mercy of the watch. The watchmen themselves were an odd breed. Half policemen, half gossip. They patrolled in pairs, carrying staves and lanterns, shouting out the hours like a living clock. 10 o'clock and all's well was less reassurance and more reminder. The city sees you. During festivals or times of unrest, their numbers doubled. That's when another rule emerged: no gatherings after dark. Too many riots, too many conspiracies. Councils across Europe began to ban street music and dancing after sundown. Even weddings had to end by curfew. It wasn't that joy was illegal, just unsupervised joy. Daytime had its own surveillance. The marketplace was the city's open eye. Every stall, every trade, every handshake was public. Inspectors roamed constantly, checking weights, watching prices, listening for rumors. Markets weren't just about commerce. They were about control. The church had its own version, confession. To the medieval mind, confession wasn't only about forgiveness. It was about information. The priest knew who had quarreled, who had stolen, who had blasphemed. And while the confessional was supposed to be private, the pulpit was not. Many sermons were suspiciously specific, aimed at certain unnamed sinners. Everyone knew who was meant. It was soft surveillance sanctified by ritual. Then came the registers. After the plague, when so many lives had disappeared unrecorded, cities began keeping lists of births, marriages, and deaths. It started as an attempt to count souls for burial and taxation. But slowly, the habit grew into something larger, a way to track movement, loyalty, and even morality. If you moved to a new district, your name went on the roll. If you married, it was noted. If you didn't attend Mass, someone eventually wrote it down. The city was learning to remember, but the more it remembered, the less it trusted. Immigrants were required to register with local guilds before working. Foreign merchants were watched closely, sometimes forced to lodge in specific inns. Travelers had to carry letters proving their origin. Those without papers were called masterless men. And that phrase was enough to make a magistrate nervous. Cities like Florence and Venice even built official guest houses, not for comfort but for containment. Strangers could sleep there for 3 nights only under guard. Longer than that, and the city began to ask questions. Privacy, in a medieval sense, wasn't a right. It was suspicious. Even morality became something to supervise. There were wardens of the night, whose job was to walk the streets listening for laughter that sounded too cheerful, music that played too long, or windows that glowed past curfew. Brothels were legalized but tightly managed. Their madams had to pay taxes and report names, not to protect anyone but to categorize everyone. The church had its parallel enforcers, the inquisitors. They didn't only chase heresy in grand trials. They policed daily behavior, reading banned books, skipping confession, even arguing with a priest. These could mark you for questioning. It wasn't constant terror, though. Most people simply adapted. They learned to perform obedience the way their ancestors had performed prayer. They lit candles when told, nodded when inspected, confessed the sins everyone expected to hear, and in return they were left alone. Because the city wasn't trying to destroy individuality. It was trying to contain it. To survive famine and plague, people had needed unity. But unity left unchecked turns into uniformity. The medieval city had found its equilibrium in a kind of managed conformity. There was safety in sameness. Still, people found ways to resist, not with rebellion, but with small, quiet tricks. They invented false compliance, sweeping only the visible parts of the street before inspections, hanging rosaries by the door while skipping Mass, baking bread smaller than the official weight but puffier, so it looked right. There was even a term for this in some city dialects, honest deceit. Everyone practiced it. Everyone understood. That's what made medieval life oddly bearable. Beneath the rigid order, there was flexibility, a shared, silent agreement between rulers and ruled. Obey in public, live in private. But the walls between public and private were beginning to crack. As cities grew wealthier and more literate, people began to write letters, diaries, and household records. They were small acts of privacy, words written for no one's eyes but their own. For the first time in centuries, individuals were beginning to think of themselves as separate from the crowd. And that quiet realization would, centuries later, birth the modern sense of self. For now, though, the city's power was still absolute. Bells marked the hours, guards marked the boundaries, priests marked the conscience. And everyone, from the richest merchant to the poorest apprentice, moved to the same rhythm. But no rule lasts forever. The next transformation wasn't driven by plague or poverty, but by something subtler, trade. Commerce would open the gates that curfews closed. It would connect cities that once feared strangers. And it would create new kinds of freedom, born not from faith or law, but from profit. And with that freedom would come a new kind of rulebook, one written not by priests or magistrates, but by merchants. By the dawn of the 15th century, the medieval city was no longer just a fortress of stone and faith. It had become a living marketplace. Trade was its heartbeat, money its blood, and trust its most delicate bone. And like every other part of urban life, commerce had its own strange rules, as binding and sacred as any sermon. A city's wealth didn't come from its walls. It came from the people passing through its gates. Merchants, pilgrims, travelers, smugglers. All of them carried something the city needed. Information. Every coin had a story, and every deal was a confession. But business in the Middle Ages wasn't simple buying and selling. It was an elaborate ritual of faith, fear, and paperwork, the medieval equivalent of high-stakes diplomacy. Because without reliable systems, trade was nothing more than an act of courage. To buy or sell across city walls, you needed more than gold. You needed a reputation. Reputation in trade worked like collateral. You could borrow money without interest if people trusted your name. But one bad deal, one rumor of dishonesty, and you'd find every door shut, every handshake withdrawn. Merchants lived or died not by their goods, but by their signatures. And that's where the letters of credit began. A strange, fragile innovation that changed the medieval world. Imagine a merchant from Venice traveling to Bruges, weeks away by road, carrying gold that far was suicide. So instead, he brought paper, a letter signed by a banker promising that payment would be made upon arrival. That scrap of ink and parchment was as good as money, if you had the right name behind it. It sounds mundane now, but at the time it was almost mystical, the idea that wealth could exist without being touched, that trust could be turned into currency. The church, predictably, hated it. Officially, charging interest was a sin, usury, a direct offense against divine charity. But the merchants found their loopholes. They didn't charge interest, they charged fees. They didn't lend money, they lent time. They wrote contracts full of sacred language and unholy cleverness. And so, quietly, profit became theology. The banker's bench, the banco, became the altar of a new religion, one where salvation came not from confession, but from a balanced ledger. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Genoa became temples of trade. Their guilds didn't just manage goods, they managed morality. A good merchant wasn't one who gave charity. He was one who kept his books honest. And honesty, conveniently, was good for business. There were rules for everything. You couldn't sell at night. You couldn't undercut prices by more than a certain margin. You couldn't sell grain during famine, even if you'd stored it yourself, unless the city allowed it. Breaking those rules wasn't just bad economics. It was heresy against the social order. And yet, those same cities thrived because their merchants broke rules in creative ways. Smuggling, hoarding, secret trading all flourished beneath the surface. The official laws kept the peace. The unofficial ones kept the market alive. Trade routes spread like veins across Europe, from the amber coasts of the Baltic to the silk markets of Constantinople. But the more the cities traded, the less they trusted their old rulers. Kings and bishops taxed too heavily, spent too freely, and understood too little about profit. So the merchants began making their own rules. They funded roads, bridges, ports. They paid guards for caravans, hired scribes for contracts, even built their own courts, the merchant courts, where disputes could be settled quickly without royal interference. Justice, they decided, was too important to be left to kings. And while the crowns slept on their thrones, the merchants quietly replaced them with gold. The irony was delicious. The same cities that once outlawed greed now ran on it. The sermon still warned that the love of money is the root of evil, but everyone listening had a side business. Still, there was guilt, always guilt. Medieval wealth came wrapped in apologies. A rich merchant might fund a hospital or a chapel to wash the sin off his fortune. His tombstone would show him kneeling, not standing, a humble sinner, weighed down by the gold he'd earned. Some even wrote instructions for their funerals. No gold rings, no fine linen, no procession, just prayers for forgiveness. And yet, their children inherited everything and built bigger houses. It was the eternal rhythm of the medieval conscience. Profit by day, repent by night. Even art became part of this moral economy. Painters were hired to fill churches with saints and halos, sponsored, naturally, by those same merchants seeking redemption. A gold-leaf Virgin Mary was as much an investment as a spice shipment. Faith and finance were merging, gilded edge to gilded edge. Meanwhile, the city itself began to change shape. Markets grew larger, more permanent. Stalls turned into shops. Shops into streets named after their trades. Fishmonger's Row, Tanner's Lane, Goldsmith's Alley. Money was organizing space now. The noise of trade was constant. The clatter of scales, the clink of coins, the low hum of haggling. Every sound had a rhythm, and that rhythm became the city's heartbeat. But as trade expanded, so did inequality. The merchants grew richer, the artisans stable, the laborers poorer. Guilds that once protected craftsmen became gatekeepers, locking out anyone without family connections. Apprentices waited years for advancement that never came. The idea of freedom through skill was fading. And beneath that growing wealth was a quiet resentment. One that would eventually boil into riots and revolutions, centuries later. For now, though, the system held, bound by the oldest medieval rule of all. Everyone must stay in their place. Still, the merchant's new world brought one final transformation, the invention of time. Not the natural kind, but the measurable kind. In a city run by trade, time became money quite literally. Bells began to mark hours for markets and work shifts, not prayers. Town halls installed the first mechanical clocks, wonders of gears and iron, ticking reminders that the city now served a different god. Efficiency. Timekeeping changed everything. Bakers started baking by schedule, not sunrise. Smiths worked to contracts, not instinct. Priests complained that people were skipping vespers to meet delivery deadlines. The rhythm of bells had shifted from divine order to economic one, and that, more than any law or guild or coin, was the quiet revolution of the medieval world. For centuries, cities had survived through faith, fear, and force. But now they were learning something subtler, routine. And routine, once established, never dies. But routine also brings restlessness. Because when life becomes predictable, people begin to dream of more. More freedom, more knowledge, more light. And from those restless dreams, something extraordinary would soon awaken. The first flicker of the Renaissance. The medieval city, for all its rules and rituals, was never meant to last forever. It had kept people alive through plagues, famines, and fire, but it had also kept them small, bound by walls, customs, and the same gray sky of obedience. And then, quietly, something began to shift. It didn't start with kings or prophets. It started in workshops. A mason carving a statue realized that the folds of a robe looked better if they followed the shape of a real body. A scribe copying an old text noticed that the numbers didn't quite add up and dared to correct them. A merchant traveling south to buy silk brought back not just fabric but stories of cities where knowledge itself was traded as a commodity. They didn't know it yet, but curiosity was about to become contagious. The first sign of it was light. Not metaphorical light, literal. Cities began to open their shutters, widen their windows, and paint their walls with color again. Stained glass became more elaborate, filtering daylight into cathedrals like rivers of jewel tones. Candles grew cheaper, allowing people to read at night. The darkness that once governed the rhythm of life began to recede, one flame at a time. And with that light came questions. If God made the stars, why couldn't they be mapped? If man was created in his image, why couldn't his body be studied? If order was divine, why did it sometimes fail? These weren't heresies yet, just thoughts, flickering like candlelight in rooms filled with parchment and ink. In Italy, the walls of monasteries and city halls began to bloom with frescoes that looked startlingly alive. Artists were suddenly studying the way muscles stretched under skin, how light curved around faces, how perspective could make a flat wall look like infinity. The rules of art, like everything else in medieval life, had always been symbolic, obedient, sacred. But now painters wanted truth. And truth, once you start looking for it, doesn't stop at the edge of a canvas. Soon, curiosity slipped from brushes to books. Scholars began reading ancient texts that had been hidden or ignored for centuries. Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, old names with new power. Their ideas filtered through cities like Florence, Venice, Paris, Oxford, carried by traders and monks, scribes and dreamers. Suddenly, Europe rediscovered that the world was bigger than it remembered. Monasteries, once dedicated solely to prayer, turned into libraries. Inks and pigments traveled farther than armies. The sound of quills scratching on vellum replaced the toll of the death bell. Knowledge became a craft, but knowledge, like trade, needed its own rules. The old church, ever cautious, tried to claim ownership of learning. If the truth was to be pursued, it had to be safely tethered to faith. But thinkers were already escaping that leash, one experiment, one question, one forbidden thought at a time. Doctors started dissecting corpses for study. Mathematicians built devices to measure stars. Engineers drew flying machines in notebooks no one was meant to see. These weren't rebels, not yet. They were craftsmen of curiosity. But every new tool they made was also a key, unlocking a door the Middle Ages had kept closed for centuries. Cities that had once been centers of prayer now became centers of invention. Florence with its workshops, Venice with its printing presses, Paris with its scholars, Nuremberg with its metal workers. For the first time, human hands were shaping not just tools, but ideas. Of course, the old world didn't vanish overnight. The streets still stank. The curfews still rang. Priests still preached that too much learning could corrupt the soul. But even the priests were reading more than they used to. They had to. Knowledge was multiplying faster than sermons could contain it. Printing, when it arrived, changed everything. Before, a book was an object of wealth, a year of labor, written by hand, decorated in gold. Now, with presses churning out pages by the hundreds, ideas could travel faster than horses. A scholar in Florence could debate a monk in Prague without ever meeting him. The world of words had broken free from parchment and found its own rhythm. And people began to read for pleasure. That may sound small, but it was revolutionary. Reading had always been duty, prayer, law, record. Now it became escape. A merchant could lose himself in tales of ancient heroes. A monk could laugh at a satire about greedy priests. A widow could find comfort in poetry instead of confession. When curiosity spreads like that, the walls start to tremble. The old authorities sensed it. They tightened their grip, passed edicts about dangerous texts, and banned certain ideas. But it was too late. The printing press didn't care about bishops. Ideas, once multiplied, could not be burned fast enough. And so, quietly, medieval certainty began to decay. Not collapse, just crumble around the edges, like an old cathedral wall slowly letting light through its cracks. People started to believe that life could be improved, not just endured. Artisans designed better tools. Farmers experimented with new crops. Builders began using mathematics instead of tradition. Even timekeeping advanced, the city clocks grew more accurate, and for the first time, schedules mattered more than seasons. That may sound dull, but it was the first real sign of freedom. People could plan. The future wasn't a mystery handed down by fate anymore. It was something that could be designed. Of course, change came unevenly. For every city reborn in color, another clung to superstition. For every philosopher with a telescope, a dozen priests still warned that curiosity was a sin. But the balance had shifted forever. The medieval city had been built on obedience, yet obedience had accidentally created the perfect breeding ground for progress. Structure, literacy, community, and habit. Once the fear faded, those same habits became ladders to something new. The people who swept streets for cleanliness were now building aqueducts. The record keepers who once counted deaths now counted discoveries. The guilds that standardized crafts now standardized knowledge. They didn't know it, but the Middle Ages were ending. And as always, endings are never loud. They begin with something small. A candle, a question, a spark. In the next chapter, those sparks will set fire to the very idea of what a city could be. Because the next set of rules weren't about survival at all. They were about living well. By the time Europe stumbled into the 15th century, the medieval city was changing faster than it could understand itself. For generations, it had been a machine for survival, a fortress against chaos, a web of rules, walls, and bells. But now, after centuries of fear, people were beginning to ask an unsettling question. What if life could be good? It started small, as all revolutions do. A cobbler in Florence began making shoes not just for utility, but for style. A baker in Paris added honey to his bread because he could. A merchant's wife hired a painter to decorate her dining room with vines and angels. These weren't acts of rebellion. They were acts of comfort. Tiny, dangerous luxuries that whispered, "Perhaps we deserve more than survival." And once that whisper began, it spread like smoke through the narrow streets. Markets grew richer. Fountains appeared in public squares, not to carry water, but to look beautiful. Guilds sponsored musicians to play at festivals. A city that once had only one kind of joy, divine, now discovered something earthlier, pleasure. But pleasure, in a society built on restraint, was both thrilling and suspicious. The church warned that comfort softened the soul. Kings warned that it made people lazy. Moralists wrote pamphlets about the dangers of silk and the sin of too much laughter. And yet, laughter echoed through the streets anyway, because for the first time in centuries, life wasn't just about avoiding death. It was about enjoying time before it. In Florence, people called it il dolce far niente, the sweetness of doing nothing. In Venice, they called it la bella vita, the beautiful life. In France, they called it luxury and pretended to feel guilty. The rich naturally led the way. Their palaces sprouted gardens where philosophers debated beside fountains. Tables groaned with imported fruit, sugar sculptures, and wine from lands they couldn't find on maps. Art, once confined to churches, now entered dining rooms, bedrooms, even courtyards. For a moment, beauty itself became a form of currency. Painters like Botticelli, architects like Brunelleschi, sculptors like Donatello, all turned comfort into meaning. They decorated life the way their ancestors had decorated altars. The city became an artwork, but beauty had its price. The same trade routes that brought silk and spices also brought envy, theft, and deceit. Cities began competing not for holiness, but for splendor. Florence wanted to outshine Venice. Venice wanted to outshine Rome. Rome wanted to outshine heaven itself. And the rules that once kept cities alive began to unravel. Sumptuary laws, those tedious medieval codes dictating who could wear what, collapsed under the weight of silk. Merchants wore colors once reserved for nobility. Bankers dressed like princes. The hierarchy that had held society together for centuries started to blur. The old guard panicked. Bishops thundered from pulpits about vanity. Magistrates fined tailors for selling forbidden fabrics. Moralists wrote about the decay of modesty, but the young ignored them. The new generation had grown up with books, color, and music. They saw the world not as a prison to endure, but as a painting to finish. And no law could stop a city that had learned to dream. Still, beneath all that splendor, the streets remained the same. Behind palaces and cathedrals, the alleys still stank of sewage. Beggars still fought for bread. Rats still claimed the corners. A city could decorate its skin, but not yet its bones. And the gap between rich and poor widened like a cracked wall. In Florence, silk merchants dined beneath frescoes while weavers starved in the next district. In Paris, nobles threw feasts that lasted days while peasants rioted over the price of bread. In London, bankers built mansions beside slums that rotted faster than they could be repaired. For every marble statue that rose, 1,000 calloused hands bled to carve it. Yet even the poor were changing. Once they had lived as subjects, obedient, invisible, grateful. But centuries of work, prayer, and habit had built something new, expectation. They began to believe they deserved more than endurance. A better wage, a shorter day, fairer life. Rebellions flickered across Europe like sparks. Short, brutal, quickly extinguished, but each leaving behind a little more ash of disobedience. The old order responded as it always had, with rules, guild restrictions, wage freezes, moral edicts, curfews reborn under new names. But the walls that once kept chaos out now kept ambition in. And ambition is harder to contain than plague. Even art began to question authority. Painters started giving saints human flaws. Sculptors carved angels that looked suspiciously like their patrons. Writers like Boccaccio and Chaucer filled their stories with laughter, sin, and satire. The divine was losing its monopoly on meaning. The medieval world had defined morality by obedience. The Renaissance redefined it by curiosity. And that shift, that tiny turn from "what must I do" to "what can I do," was the hinge upon which modern life began to swing. Cities, once ruled by divine fear, were now ruled by possibility. New rules emerged, not carved into law but whispered through behavior. It was no longer sinful to profit, as long as you looked humble about it. It was no longer shameful to enjoy art, as long as you donated to a church. It was no longer heretical to think, as long as you didn't say it too loudly. It was a world learning to live in contradictions. Faith and science, wealth and guilt, pleasure and fear. But somehow the contradictions held, like the arches of a cathedral, perfectly balanced because each side leaned against the other. This was the strange genius of the city. It never resolved its conflicts. It just built taller walls around them. And those walls, shimmering with frescoes and firelight, still held the same truth they always had. Civilization doesn't begin with order. It begins with improvisation. The medieval world had survived chaos. Now it was learning to live with complexity. The cities that had once saved humanity from the wilderness were now laboratories of its imagination. And imagination, unlike law or faith, cannot be ruled for long. By the late 15th century, medieval cities had become something extraordinary, places that ran not on swords or saints, but on paperwork. Charters, ledgers, contracts, treaties, tax lists, census scrolls, the whole machine of civilization written out in ink. Bureaucracy, that dull miracle of human order, had arrived. And yet, this was not the paperwork of obedience. It was the paperwork of control. For centuries, kings had ruled by divine right, their authority descending from heaven like sunlight. But merchants and magistrates were discovering something far more powerful: the written word. A law signed on parchment was harder to ignore than any sermon. The old balance between crown, church, and city began to tilt. Kings still claimed divine sanction, but cities held the purse strings. Cathedrals still rang with hymns, but printing presses now hummed with pamphlets. What priests once whispered in Latin, printers now shouted in every language under the sun. The new power wasn't sacred, it was civic. City councils began passing ordinances without waiting for bishops or barons. They taxed merchants to build roads. They regulated trade fairs. They enforced sanitation, minted coins, issued public notices. For the first time since Rome, people were being governed not by faith, but by administration. Sounds boring, and it was, but that boredom was revolutionary. A city could no longer rely on miracles. It needed paperwork, and so it invented bureaucracy, the art of keeping chaos in folders. Records were written, sealed, filed, and stored in archives that smelled of dust and wax. Scribes became the quiet nobility of the age, their hands shaping more history than any sword. And through this slow, methodical process, a dangerous idea emerged. Authority could be made, not inherited. Once, the right to rule came from birth. Now, it came from a stamp, a seal, a signature. A citizen with a quill could wield more power than a knight with a blade. That shift, subtle as ink drying on parchment, would one day unravel monarchies. But for now, it gave cities their soul. Still, every form of order breeds its own corruption. Officials hoarded bribes. Records were lost in exchange for favors. Decrees were rewritten for the right price. The city that once prided itself on moral precision now found itself tangled in its own red tape. And yet, the system held because for all its flaws, it worked. The streets were cleaner, the markets fairer, the bridges stronger. Taxes were predictable, and so were punishments. The randomness of medieval life was slowly being replaced by pattern. But in replacing chaos with order, cities also replaced freedom with formality. You couldn't sell a loaf of bread without a license. You couldn't build a house without approval. You couldn't speak too loudly in the square without attracting a clerk's attention. Even survival now required documentation. In Venice, citizens carried passes identifying their trade and residence. In Florence, tax lists named every household down to the last spoon. In Paris, the watchman recorded nightly reports that read like poetry of paranoia. 2 drunkards in Rue Saint-Denis. 1 cat stolen. No fire. People were being written into history whether they liked it or not. The same paper that protected them also trapped them. And from that contradiction, safety versus autonomy, would rise the politics of the modern world. The church, meanwhile, was struggling to keep up. Printing had turned belief into an open market. Doctrines that once took years to spread now circled Europe in weeks. Priests who had once guarded truth like treasure suddenly found their sermons competing with pamphlets, satire, and songs. Every tavern had a theologian now. Every market had a rumor about Rome. Authority, once absolute, had to negotiate with gossip. To fight back, the church adapted. It censored books, excommunicated printers, burned presses. But even as it fought the flood, it learned to swim. Bishops hired scholars to write official texts. Monks became editors. Papal bulls were printed and sold. The same machine that spread rebellion also carried its decrees. Meanwhile, cities found a new kind of pride, civic identity. Florentines boasted of their architecture. Venetians of their navy. Parisians of their theater. Each city had become a world unto itself, a blend of religion, trade, and art held together by local law and sheer arrogance. But beneath all that beauty and confidence lay tension. The old feudal order was dying, but no one had told the kings. They still demanded loyalty and taxes, still waged wars that drained treasuries. But now the cities had accountants. They could calculate how much a war actually cost. And suddenly, faith and patriotism looked like very bad investments. In the taverns, people began muttering things like, If the king needs our coin, shouldn't we have a say? It was a small thought, dangerous, infectious. The next few centuries would turn that question into revolutions. But for now, cities remained loyal, sort of. They built monuments to their rulers, even as they quietly built systems to outlast them. They minted coins with royal faces, but the gold came from their own merchants. They prayed in churches under the watch of bishops, but the art inside was paid for by bankers. Medieval Europe had perfected the art of polite rebellion. Everything looked obedient on the surface, but beneath it, people were rewriting the meaning of power, trade, and belief one ledger at a time. The strangest thing? No one planned it. No manifesto, no revolution, no grand design. Just countless individuals doing their jobs. Writing, measuring, trading, enforcing, copying, until suddenly, without realizing it, they had built the skeleton of the modern world. The medieval city had survived war, plague, famine, and fire. Now it had survived itself. But the Renaissance, that glittering explosion of art, science, and self-awareness, was no paradise. It was built on the bones of exhaustion. The rules that kept cities alive were being rewritten again, this time in the language of ambition. Because survival was no longer enough. Humanity was ready for something else. It wanted greatness, and greatness, as every empire eventually learns, is the most dangerous survival strategy of all. By the time the Renaissance had burned its brilliance across Europe, the old medieval cities looked almost unrecognizable. The walls still stood, the bells still rang, but the world inside them had quietly turned upside down. What had once been a network of survival rules about bread, curfews, and markets had become something far grander, civilization itself. And yet, for all the art and learning and light, the strange truth remained. The same laws that once kept people from dying were still keeping them in line. They just wore new clothes. The guilds had become companies. The watchmen, police. The scribes, bureaucrats. The same instinct that made a baker weigh his flour to the ounce now made bankers balance their ledgers and surgeons measure their incisions. Precision, once a moral duty, had become a science. The medieval obsession with order hadn't disappeared. It had evolved. You can still see it today in city councils, traffic signs, building codes, restaurant inspections. Those endless little rules that keep a place functioning without anyone quite noticing. They're relics of a time when every mistake could mean plague, famine, or fire. Modern life, for all its electricity and glass, still runs on medieval logic. Structure first, freedom later. That's why the cities of the Middle Ages mattered so much. They weren't just collections of buildings. They were experiments, messy, human, endlessly adaptive. And from their chaos came the template for everything that followed. The first passports? City-issued letters of passage. The first police? Night watchmen enforcing curfew. The first public health laws? Ordinances about where to dump waste and how to bake bread. The first universities? Monastic schools that opened their doors to merchants' sons. The first democracy in Europe? Born not in a palace, but in a city council hall lined with wax seals and ink stains. The miracle wasn't that medieval cities survived. It was that they created a world where survival could become progress. But progress always has a price. As cities grew richer, they grew hungrier for land, for labor, for control. They built empires on trade routes that once only carried spices. They enslaved new worlds with the same logic that once kept their own streets clean. Order must be maintained. And when the age of discovery dawned, it wasn't kings or priests who pushed it forward. It was the children of those same merchants, masons, and scholars who had learned, centuries earlier, how to make the impossible work on a crowded medieval street. The ships that sailed from Lisbon and Venice were floating cities, ruled by hierarchy, governed by rules, powered by routine. Medieval discipline disguised as exploration. The irony of history is that every age believes it has escaped the past. But the past never really lets go. The cities that once fought to keep plague at bay had invented the idea of public health. The cities that punished thieves had invented the idea of law. The cities that taxed bread had invented economics. And the cities that once prayed for survival had, by pure accident, invented ambition. In their narrow streets and smoky halls, people discovered that you could build a system from nothing, that humanity could organize itself into something bigger than instinct or fear. That realization was the seed of everything that came next. Revolutions, science, democracy, bureaucracy, even modern boredom. Because that's the real inheritance of the Middle Ages, the strange comfort of routine. The same bells that once signaled curfew now tell us when to start work. The same markets that once sold apples and candles now sell futures and stocks. The same prayers for protection have become emails, deadlines, and calendar alerts. We still live by the same rules, just with better plumbing. And yet, something of the medieval spirit endures, that mix of faith, fear, and practicality that made ordinary people build extraordinary worlds. They didn't think of themselves as heroes. They didn't have manifestos or slogans. They were just trying to survive one more day, to keep the bread unspoiled, the walls standing, the water flowing. And somehow, in doing that, they created systems strong enough to carry us for centuries. You can still walk through the old quarters of cities like Florence, Prague, or York and feel it, that quiet hum of ancient order. The cobblestones polished by thousands of feet. The crooked alleys still obeying invisible laws written long before maps existed. The bells still ringing, not for prayer anymore, but for the rhythm of time itself. The people who built those cities lived in a world that made no promises. Their lives were short. Their nights were long. Their skies were often gray. But their discipline, their strange, exhausting, miraculous discipline, kept the light burning through it all. And that's what the strange rules of medieval cities were really about. They weren't just rules for staying alive. They were the first notes of a much larger song. The one we're still humming today, every time we follow a schedule, pay a tax, or obey a red light. The melody of order, born from chaos, sustained by habit, still echoing 8 centuries later. The Middle Ages didn't end when the Renaissance began. They just moved in with us, into our governments, our streets, our calendars. Every spreadsheet, every law, every city ordinance is a medieval prayer rewritten in modern ink. And when you really think about it, all the madness, all the filth, all the fear and noise of those ancient cities, maybe it's not strange at all that they survived. Maybe the strange thing is that we did, because in a way we never left them.